All right. All right, so we're live now. I want to welcome everyone to our second StartSmart webinar series. Today we have Salah Habis, our marketing and outreach manager from Flat6Labs Bahrain. He will be interviewing the renowned global investor and author of Out-Innovate, Alex Lazarow. They will be discussing how entrepreneurs in the MENA region are implementing innovative approaches to run a successful startup. Just a little bit about Alex. He spent his career working at the intersection of investing, innovation, and economic development across the private, public, and social sectors. He's a venture capitalist with Cathy Innovation, a global firm that invests across Africa, Asia, Europe, and North America. Alex worked with Umdi Network, and he served as a consultant with McKinsey, banks in Canada, and an M&A investor. Salah spent most of his career in marketing and outreach posts in Bahrain, with his current role involving scouting startups in the region and across the globe, creating strategic partnerships and consolidating Flat6Labs Bahrain on a regional and international network of VCs for follow-on funding. This is the agenda for today. Like, the interview would be approximately 25 to 30 minutes, and you can all submit your questions on the Zoom link box or on YouTube in the comments box, and we'll be taking questions from everyone in the end. I'll leave it to Salah now to get it started.
All right, well, Alex, thank you for being with us today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. And I guess we'll start off with the book that you've had released recently, Out-Innovate. It really touches on a lot of the key challenges that founders in emerging ecosystems, especially even here in the MENA region, face on a daily basis. And what was it that initially inspired you to write this book?
I think we might have lost Alex.
Yeah, it looks like we're having a little bit of a technical issue right now.
Yeah, exactly. Well then, how about you tell us a little bit about Alex's book?
Yeah, so Alex's book is pretty much, it's all based around his experience in investing globally across different regions. And he'll explain further on his kind of concept of the idea of the frontier, but the main key points I think he's trying to touch on is where the challenges that you face in these emerging startup ecosystems, where you have a lack of access to capital and lack of access to a pool of highly skilled human resource talent, and the way that they're kind of restructuring their startups. So he's back here now, and I think he's ready to. Are you ready to start the interview?
Mysteriously, you know, living in the heart of Silicon Valley, I can't even keep a web signal. I don't even know what happened. I'm now calling back on my cell phone.
Perfect timing as well, right on the first question.
Well, anyways, I'm super delighted to be here, and on this auspicious start, let's dive in.
Yeah. Did you hear the first question, or did you cut out before that?
Literally, you said thank you for Alex for joining us, and then I was off. So.
All right. So to start off with the first question, Out-Innovate, your new book that's just been released. It touches on a lot of the key challenges that founders in emerging ecosystems, especially over here in the MENA region, face on a daily basis. And so I guess just to kind of give all the listeners a background on what it was that inspired you to write this book.
Yeah, absolutely. So my day job is I invest in startups around the world. As you mentioned, I'm an investor with Cathy Innovation, a globally focused fund. Before that, I was with Umdi Network. Outside of work, I teach innovation at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies, which is Middlebury College's graduate program in Monterey. And many of my students were, you know, either going back home after their MBA programs. You know, I grew up in the Midwest in Canada, or moving to emerging markets to start their businesses. And I was getting really frustrated that I kept assigning my students books on innovation, things like Blitzscaling by Reid Hoffman and Chris Ye, or Ben Horowitz The Hard Thing About Hard Things, or what have you, which are excellent books. But I always felt like I had to contextualize them with the reality of building startups in more emerging ecosystems. And I started this book essentially to solve that problem. I believe that the best entrepreneurs operating across Chicago or Detroit or Amsterdam or Bahrain or Bangalore or Nairobi have more in common with the best entrepreneurs in Sao Paulo than they do with those in San Francisco. And yet, no one is telling their stories. And I wanted to start that conversation. And so the result of that is this book, Out-Innovate, How Global Entrepreneurs from Delhi to Detroit Are Rewriting the Rules of Silicon Valley. And the thesis is really that. It's that everything we know about startup best practice is rooted in this particular context in Silicon Valley for asset-light, fast-growing startups. And yet around the world, the context is different. There's less capital. In some cases, there's less depth of trained startup human capital. There is macroeconomic conditions that are more susceptible to shocks. And in that context, a different playbook matters. And by the way, we are now living, I started this book 2 years ago. Obviously, the world has changed in the last 2 months. In many ways, I think that Silicon Valley has much to learn with how the best entrepreneurs around the world are operating as well. Because in many ways, the lessons in the book are when people out of constraints are actually building strategies that have advantages. I think we can now learn in the Valley as well. And so that's the reason I wrote the book, but also why I think it's not just relevant to entrepreneurs across the MENA region, but also across the world, including in the Valley.
Yeah, I guess it also kind of makes people reconsider the way that they've had their strategic approach to problem solving as well, by taking a lesson from people that have dealt with a lot of barriers that aren't usually considered normal in the West, pretty much. So moving on to the next question, your book is called Out-Innovate. For decades, the world has focused on Silicon Valley as the center of innovation. The reality is that their rules don't work everywhere. In fact, you found that entrepreneurs outside established startup ecosystems, which you refer to as the frontier, are out-innovating their Silicon Valley counterparts. Can you give us an example of frontier startup ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the book, I make a simplification in the world where I say, look, there is this new frontier of innovation. And the idea is exactly that, right? Historically, startup innovation was centered in a couple of centers. Today, it's global. There's over 1.3 million startups around the world and about 480 startup hubs, right? So there's this new wave of ecosystems around the world that we are all part of. And it's obviously too simple to say there's Silicon Valley and not Silicon Valley. And so in the book, I think of two dimensions that I think are important. There's many others, but two that I center around. And if you map it as a 2x2 matrix in your head, you might say, on the one hand, whether or not the ecosystem is in a developed country or less developed country. And on the other, you might say, how developed is the startup ecosystem as well? And so perhaps top right, Silicon Valley is there, developed country, developed startup ecosystem. Perhaps bottom left, one of the case studies in my book is in Pyongyang, right? More developing startup ecosystem, very developing country. And then you say, look, there's actually a lot of nuance, right? Perhaps a place like Bangalore has a very developed startup ecosystem in developing India context. And where I'm from in Winnipeg, in Canada, developed market country, very developing startup ecosystem. And so in the book, I actually did this on purpose in some ways, where I tried to take the most extreme examples to really juxtapose opposites, but actually to pick apart some of the nuances. I also compare Silicon Valley to places like Chicago or other cities in the same country. And so when you read the book, I think it's important not to think about the book as a recipe. It isn't do A, B, C, and you will get successful outcome. Think of it much more as a menu where, look, obviously, Bahrain is different than kind of every other country in the MENA region, right? Like Cairo is different than Dubai. And so therefore, some of the lessons are going to port, but not everything and not uniformly. And similarly in the book, I think that as entrepreneurs, I wanted to start a conversation around some of this emerging best practice happening around the world. Some of it will be helpful and relevant and germane. Take it, inspire yourself from it. Some of it will say, look, that isn't relevant to my context, and that's okay. And so I think that's why I call it a playbook. In many ways, it's a little bit like a coach on a football field. Say, look, in this particular situation, I'm going to take this strategy, and that's what I wanted to kick off.
Cool, great. And so it kind of gives you a reference of context for different solutions for different scenarios, different kinds of environmental settings. The value of death model is Silicon Valley's approach to building startups where growth is prioritized over profit. Startups raise huge amounts of capital, often subsidizing costs to drive usage, with the plan that revenue will make a magic leap to shift upward exponentially. However, the reality is that many startups don't have to, and in fact, shouldn't take this approach. Why not?
So this is an interesting question, right? And by the way, I love the magic leap there. But this is an interesting question. Well, I started the book about 2 years ago when everything in the Valley, it was this time of abundance, and bigger venture capital firms were getting raised. SoftBank was launching a $100 billion fund, right? And in that context, there was this approach of, look, growth at all costs as the means to scale every startup and to succeed. And I wrote the book with this belief that that approach doesn't work uniformly. It works in the Valley for a very particular type of startup in a very particular type of context. But I don't think it works for the majority of startups, and certainly not around the majority of the world. And so the concept of the Valley of Death is in some ways universal to all startups, which is this idea that in the early days, startups don't have revenue. They're building an idea, and there might be a revenue curve. And then at the same time, they're investing towards the business over time. The question is how deep is that trough that of cumulative investment before you get back to a break even and then hopefully pay back? In Silicon Valley, in the context of abundance, it's okay to deepen the trough, to essentially increase burn, to subsidize products, to a bunch of these things in service of accelerating the revenue curve, right? And that, if you think of the blitzscaling model or the fat cat strategy or some of these things that are strategies that people talk about in the Valley, like that's really what it's about, right? And that strategy can pay off very handsomely, and you can get folks on the other side. My argument in the book is that actually on a risk-adjusted basis, you could do so much more reliably by thinking about growth in a long-term way. And so we can talk a little bit about some of the strategies that I envision on that, but that's kind of the tee up and I think the context. And it's really interesting to be launching a book during the Corona time, because in many ways, this is one of the areas where I believe entrepreneurs around the world have so much to learn from the leading frontier investors, particularly, unicorns and et cetera, that are now having to rethink their model.
Yeah, and so instead of focusing on this kind of billion-dollar imaginary unicorns, you say that more appropriate mascot for a startup should be a camel, because they are resilient and can survive in the harshest places on Earth. Can you elaborate and give us an example of what a startup of this nature would look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I chose the camel as the animal we use because it's a real animal. It exists in real lands. It can sprint across the desert when needed, but also and drink water faster than almost any other animal, but can also survive in the world's harshest environments. And so that was the reason I chose that analogy. And the idea really is that camels build startups that still want to grow extraordinarily fast. They still want to benefit from network effects, but they do so by infusing the business with sustainability and resilience from day one. And so what do I mean? It means a couple of things. One, from the unit economics perspective, right? It's figuring out the value you provide and charging for that value up front, rather than subsidizing in service of growth. Two is when you have the option of burning, thinking about what the burn you're going to do and managing that cost curve such that you're not going as deep and as down. And third is taking a long-term view to it. I'll give you one US-centric example that I think is interesting because it juxtaposes with this other model I'm talking about, which is in the on-demand delivery space, a company called Grubhub. So in the US, I often associate on-demand delivery with these models that raise a ton of capital. Think of DoorDash, which has raised $1.5 billion. Grubhub was built out of Chicago. They were sustainable at every single fundraise. And when I interviewed Mike Evans, the COO, he talked, and one of the co-founders, he talked a lot about how every single fundraise was done for a specific purpose. So one of them was to expand to a couple cities, another was to do an acquisition. They raised, still a big number, but a paltry $80 million to get to a multi-billion-dollar valuation, in part because of this strategy. And to the point of taking this long-term view, I had asked him, I was like, look, like, what would you have done if you had more capital? What would you have done if you were more aggressive? And he said, look, I could have IPO'd, I think they IPO'd in 8 years. Like I could IPO in 2 years less, right, in 6 years. But I would have done so in meaningfully more risk. And I think that's the point that I'm trying to make the argument here, is that if we look back at successful companies, we say, look, like, X company is a successful outcome. And you say, you play that story 10 times. How many of those times do you get that outcome? It happens that we are living in the world where that company was successful. But I believe a Camel strategy, if you were going to replay that strategy, more often you would get the outcome that you get at the end, because you're doing it with sustainability and resilience. It might take longer, right? It might be a little bit less of a sexy strategy, but I actually believe it's one of these back to basics. And this is one where, I think is very germane to the context we live in today. But I think it's one where frontier innovators have been really at the lead of this all along.
Cool. And so in Out-Innovate, you say that the frontier innovators, sometimes they need to build the full stack. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah. And this is an example of, if I thought of one of the macro arcs in the book, is this idea that entrepreneurs around the world have to do more with less. And that offers challenges, but that also offers some opportunities. And the full stack is one of those examples where, if you think about what entrepreneurs in emerging markets have to do, they have to do more things, right? Think of a e-commerce player that is building something. One of the companies I interviewed was Fetcher, for instance, which is in the Middle East, does last mile e-commerce. For Idris to build that business, it wasn't as simple as just building an e-commerce delivery platform. He also had to figure out how to do cash on delivery. He also had to figure out how to recruit drivers and have a HR recruiting team. He had to do a bunch of these other adjacent businesses to be able to only do the same business that one of their Silicon Valley counterparts have to do. And so that's this idea of the full stack. And I think of it as a vertical full stack. It's having to build a bunch of business infrastructure that doesn't exist in the rich tapestry of startups that you might have in the Valley, that ultimately serve the purpose of building the startup that you want to do. And it obviously makes the mountain that much harder to climb in the short term, right? It's obviously a big challenge. At the same time, it's one of these things where I think it offers an advantage. And one advantage is, it's really hard. It builds a moat over time. So that's an advantage. I think there's some other ones that are interesting too, and a little bit more nuanced, like a capital moat. If you're operating an ecosystem with less capital or less specialized investors on a particular thing, and you're able to bring some of them together, that's an advantage. There's a couple of these other dimensions. So that's this idea of the full stack that I explore in the book. And I think one of them, and the most prescient, is this vertical one. I also explore this idea of the horizontal stack and how I've observed many entrepreneurs building an ecosystem of products and services in service of the end goal that they want, and some of the dimensions of that too. And we can go into that in Q&A, but that's the idea around that.
Cool. So you point out that the Silicon Valley focuses on A players in contrast to startups and frontier ecosystems that have an A team approach. Can you tell us more about this difference and why it's so critical for long-term success?
Yeah. So in Silicon Valley, the HR model is built out of a context, right? And the context is there's a very, very deep specialized startup talent pool. I believe that talent is distributed evenly and opportunity is not. And in many ecosystems, there have not yet been folks that have scaled a company to IPO and doing very specialized things. Like that specialized talent pool does not yet exist in some ecosystems, or it is more nascent and it's growing. And so in the Valley, I talk about this idea of hiring only A players, which is this idea that, look, you've got a job, hire the best person you can find, and it's okay if there's high churn. High churn is built into the business model, right? Like, Uber's average tenure is, I think, 13 months, one of the stats I read, right? Google's less than 2 years. That's okay because you can replace them with someone else. There'll be someone else as well in the ecosystem, and that's built into the business model. And I think around the world, the best entrepreneurs take this approach of hiring A teams instead. And so what do I mean by that? I think it means rethinking, one, how do you actually find candidates? And in some cases, develop the pipeline. Two is, how do you think about retaining those candidates? And in some ways, it also involves rethinking compensation. And three is taking this long-term approach to growth and how that plays out. I'll give you one example just on this pipeline bit, because I think it's interesting. And we could talk more about some of the others later. But this company called Hotels.ng, which is based in Nigeria. And they were finding that they were struggling to find engineers in the Lagos area. They're essentially like a booking.com for hotels in the country. And also they believe that there were a lot of engineers around the country that they were not finding. And so what they started was a virtual internship, a Slack internship, where every week they would give one Slack problem, and whoever answered it correctly would proceed to the next one and the next one. And then over time, they would whittle down this talent pool to the actual best candidates based on the actual output that is observed. And so in the last class, I think they had 1,000 candidates that started. They paid them a little stipend. People did this kind of nights and weekends, and then had about 25 people at the end. And so, by the way, one of these programs, most of the candidates came from outside Lagos, so they really were discovering them. And B, they actually had a more diverse class. They had a lot of these other advantages. They're really able to judge output rather than kind of perceived output. And so I think it's one of these dimensions. And as a result, they've actually also had a pretty loyal workforce of folks that have been given a shot. And so I think that's one example of kind of this idea of rethinking the pipeline, but kind of this broader theme of how do you actually build an A team and keep it and grow it over time.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of startups in the MENA region can relate to, especially even here in Bahrain. Most of our successful startups have they've built an entire team from scratch and gradually upskilled them to the point where they're actually globally on a professional level and proficient and competitive.
And by the way, I was just going to say, as a side note to that, I actually think that is one of the powerful impacts in startup ecosystem development too, which is when startups scale, they're actually training the next generation of entrepreneurs. And so I think we're going to see more and more of that as we're seeing successful stories coming out of locations around the world.
Definitely.
I interrupt you.
So with the increase of the coronavirus epidemic, some companies have found it beneficial to be distributed across various geographies. Whatever benefits are there for having a distributed team?
Yeah, so this is one of these other examples, right, of taking a strategy out of a constraint, and I believe actually turning it into a massive advantage. And my Twitter is blowing up with people sending me photos of their Zoom setups at home with the fancy cameras. But best practice around this has actually already been developed. It's been developed by the leading startups outside Silicon Valley that are doing this for a very strategic reason. I think there's three really important reasons why startups outside the Valley have chosen to be distributed. And by the way, distributed, I think there's a range of what that means, right? Distributed could be, look, I'm gonna have many offices, all the way to this idea of being fully remote, and then a couple of different options within that, right? So one, there's a range. But the reason that I think people do it is, one, accessing the best talent around the world. And if I was going to give you an example, if I was building a startup in Winnipeg and I was looking for a CMO that had scaled a startup to IPO and that knew how to do things as niche as like SEO at scale or what have you, look, like there aren't 50 of those candidates in Winnipeg. I'm not sure there's 5, and I would have to. And perhaps the people that were qualified already have jobs at other high growth companies, right? And so I'd have to think, how do I solve this problem? And one of the solutions I would do is I'd say, look, I'm going to hire that person wherever they are and build a team around that. So I think that's one. I think, by the way, there's a nuance that I think is interesting, is that we're seeing different ecosystems being powerful at different things or specialized at different things. And so I've seen a lot of startups, for instance, in the US expand to Salt Lake City for their sales expertise, or to Toronto or Montreal for their ML or artificial intelligence coding. And a lot of startups in Southeast Asia are expanding to Bangalore for the IT and folks like that, and build their IT teams. So I think it's not just tapping the world's best talent wherever, but also tapping centers of expertise as well. The second reason, if you are operating at a high cost center, it's an opportunity to leverage lower costs, right? Like I think is one of the impetuses for why the Valley or New York and others are starting to do it. I don't think that's the best reason to do it, but I think it's an advantage. The third, which I think is interesting, is in many markets, I think this is definitely true in the MENA region, is startups have to be born global, right? They're launching across many markets from day one. That's a really tough thing to do. It's tough to build a team, an organization, a culture, a product that can do it. Building distributed in some ways builds that muscle a little bit. If you figure out a way to operate across a couple of different regions, or even in a fully remote setting, you're actually building the muscle on how to do some of this too. And so I think that's another advantage that's often ignored. And ultimately, it's no surprise to me that the leaders at distributed teams are not in the Valley, right? It's companies like Basecamp out of Chicago, or Zapier out of Missouri, or Globant out of Latin America. Fetcher, which I mentioned earlier, right, is a really good example of that too, right? They have operations in Dubai, they have a call center in Cairo, they have a bunch of different offices regionally to do different things. And I think we're seeing more and more of that by necessity, but actually in times like this, it actually gives a really powerful advantage, which is resiliency. And I think that's underappreciated.
Yeah, I totally agree. And especially when it comes to Winnipeg, I think that's where it'd be amazing to have geographically distributed teams, because I think most people would like to stay away from those kind of winters that you experience over there. For most of the listeners, I'm not sure if they're aware about Winnipeg, but it's one of the coldest, if not the coldest city on earth, pretty much. So
last winter, there was a temperature that was recorded that was colder than the surface of Mars. And so anyways, I've grown soft living in San Francisco, though.
Yeah, I remember when I was in university over there, you used to see these documentaries about how they would brave the cold -20°C winds to get to the North Pole, on National Geographic. And then we would go and walk to the business school in -45°C at 8 a.m. in the morning. So
those were the days.
Yeah. So what lessons do you think Silicon Valley can learn from frontier innovators?
Yeah, I think this is the moment for Silicon Valley to learn from the Valley, learn from entrepreneurs around the world, right? Silicon Valley has been this fount of wisdom for the world, and yet I think our model is showing some cracks, right? I think it's showing some cracks around this growth at all cost methodology. It's showing some cracks around this notion, this conventional wisdom that all your people need to be in one office, etc. I think it's showing some cracks across a bunch of these dimensions, and this new model, I think, offers us some lessons as well. I'm actually, in the book, I talk about this idea of the Detroit moment. If you think of 100 years ago, where the center of innovation was, it wasn't Silicon Valley, it wasn't Boston, it wasn't London, it was Detroit. And the technology of the day wasn't software, it was cars. Yeah, and if you were an entrepreneur that was going to build a world-changing thing, you would go and you build a car company in Detroit. There's hundreds of car startups. Fast forward, what happened, right? Innovation became global. And today, the most reliable cars are built in Japan. The center of raw engineering might be Germany. The sexiest sports cars might be in Italy. And the head of the electric cars might be arguably Silicon Valley or Shenzhen in China, right? I think the same thing could happen to the Valley, where, look, the Valley will continue to be a center of innovation, but it must also learn from these centers of innovation all around the world as well. If not, they will overtake it over time. And different centers become very good at different things because of their regional specializations. And so I think that's why it's so critical, not just for us outside the Valley to learn from each other, but also from the Valley to take a moment and learn as well.
Cool. And another thing you bring up in Out-Innovate is how startups in the frontier ecosystems need to be born global, essentially. Can you elaborate on the idea of a startup being born global?
Yeah, and I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but it's, in many ecosystems, startups don't have the luxury of operating in a 300 million person market in, or whatever that a Silicon Valley startup has tackling the US market. If you're an operator in Dubai or in, frankly, whatever emerging market, that isn't among the biggest local markets, you often have to think global or regional from day one. And so that's that idea. It's this notion that to build a business with a TAM that is large enough, not universally for every business model and not universally for every market, but in many markets, you often have to think about how do you expand across a bunch of different geographies. And that means How do you build a product and service that scales across geos and adapts? How do you build a team that can communicate across borders? How do you do all these things to be born global and build that muscle from day one? There's an interesting statistic that I looked at for Southeast Asia, a different region, but 7 out of the 10 unicorns there were regional, and they did so in the very first couple of years. And those that weren't kind of born global in that region were based in Indonesia, which 200 million person market. So but for all the other markets, they had to be regional from the get-go. And I think we see that already, obviously in the Middle East among the startups that have scaled, and to be able to do that, they've been able to be born global. And I think that'll be a skill set that'll be increasingly important.
And so going forward, where do you see the venture capital model adapting, and how do you see it changing in the future?
Yeah, well, so the VC model in context is actually in some ways in service of entrepreneurs, right? The VC model is old. It actually didn't originate in Silicon Valley. Its roots are older. It started actually in the whaling industry in New Bedford. And it was innovation that meant that New Bedford became the center of whaling. 70% of the whaling industry was in the US, and 70% of that was in one small little town. And the model that we have today, right, of VCs funding entrepreneurs, VCs being funded by investors, is the exact same reason. No wonder carried interest. It was literally what you could carry off the boat, right? That model has been adapted very successfully to the Silicon Valley model, and I think works extraordinarily well for a very particular startup. And obviously I'm biased, I'm a venture capitalist, right? But I don't believe that model works universally and uniformly for everything. And I think there's a couple of dimensions to this. One is startup ecosystems becoming more global. I think 2, startups are camels, perhaps not unicorns, all unicorn global, growth at all costs, style players everywhere, etc. And so I think that and there are now 480 startup hubs around the world. And so as a consequence, I'm observing some changes in the model as well. And these are very nascent, but I think these are some that I'm very excited about. And I think there's 3. The first is I'm observing some changes in the instruments being invested. And so, we found our inspiration in the whaling industry that gave us preferred equity. Another high-risk industry is mining. And that has the royalty-based payment is the way they do it. And we're seeing some experiments around revenue share as something. And by the way, no wonder that the leading revenue share players are coming from outside the valley, right? Companies like Lighter Capital in Seattle or Clearbank in Toronto, and there's many in emerging markets too. Second, we're seeing some evolution in who is playing and how they're playing. And so it's less just the VCs. In China, for instance, we've seen the rise of corporate players, and not just as investors, but also bringing startups into the web of their ecosystem to really help them scale. And I think we'll see more of that, the rise of impact investors, et cetera. And 3, and how decisions are being made. One trend, for instance, I'm excited about is the infusion of computerized decision-making, not this kind of a little bit more art decision-making, but how do you actually infuse some of it with computerized decision-making? There's some experiments on it where VCs have used this, and actually the result has been a wider geographic dispersion of where they're investing, because they're less beholden to investing locally. They're able to invest all over the world. And so I think we're going to see some evolution. Like, all these things are very nascent, right? The fund I work at itself is a innovator in that department, right? We're born global. We're covering a bunch of geographies. I think we're going to see more and more of that innovation over time, which I think is tremendously exciting. But I think it's important that VC be in service to the entrepreneurs we support, and that model be adapted. One of the entrepreneurs I interviewed, Eric Hersman, who's a pioneer in the East Africa tech scene, said it really nicely. He said, look, like, we need to make sure the tail doesn't wag the dog. And so what he meant by that was, if a startup is shaping their story and their strategy to be able to attract VC, we got a problem, right? VC needs to support the startup in the way it's going to get built. And that's critical. And I think we need to adapt and think about the model to make sure it works and is regionalized and is adapted in every ecosystem. So I'll pause there. I know we've got some questions for Q&A as well.
Just one last question before we move on to Q&A. So one of the main barriers for startups that exist today in emerging startup ecosystems, or the frontier, is regulators and the regulations surrounding the possibilities for them to incorporate in multiple sectors, the ability for them to have growth and to scale beyond their borders. What steps would you advise could be taken to address this issue? How can government regulators kind of really work and adapt around the startup ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an area of personal interest for me. The book is not about startup ecosystem development. It's much more about how to scale startups in the context of more emerging ecosystems. But as a result, I think there's some tactical things that ecosystem players, including the government, foundations, corporates, and others can do to support it. And in the book, I argue that we have this playbook around building startup ecosystems, but we often ignore what it actually takes to build startups in other ecosystems. And so, I'll give you one example, which I think is germane to your question, which is this question of the full stack. In many startup ecosystems, there isn't a really good addressing, right? Half the world doesn't have a formal address. There isn't a really good identity system, right? Where people don't have formal identity cards. That makes it tough to register for a variety of products and services like bank accounts or get e-commerce delivered or what have you. And as a result, a lot of startups have had to build their own addressing or identity layers. And so one of the things that I think is interesting is how can we as ecosystem builders help solve some of those problems? One initiative I think is really exciting is out of India, which is the Aadhaar program, which is the largest biometric identity scheme around the world. Essentially, they're giving everyone a formal identity run by the government. But on top of that, they're building an API stack in partnership with iSpirit, where there will be a variety of tools. And I think those all taken together actually are a tool set that'll help all startups, but actually upon which we'll be able to build a bunch of other things too that are pretty exciting. So I think that's a good example of a program that is solving a particular problem that is unique to how frontier innovators are building their startups. And that also will be a really powerful experiment to how to do that. So we could talk more about some other thoughts on that, but I wanted to plant that seed.
Great. I think that's going to be really valuable because we've got quite a few people that are tuning in from economic development boards and also on the regulatory side who would appreciate that information. So now moving on into the Q&A from our viewers. We have a mix. We've got some questions which we collected from a few days before the actual webinar, and we have some that are coming in live right now through Zoom, and I believe Sar is also going to be submitting some that are coming in through YouTube in the comment section over there. So to start off with, I'm just going to go direct to a personal question that's for you. So
yeah, all the hard ones I'm throwing back at you though.
Yeah, all right. So the first one was, what was the important skill, or what's the most beneficial skill that you've obtained over your career that has helped you, whether it's in your personal life or in your professional life?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I valued in my life is that I've had the opportunity to work across a bunch of different contexts. So, professionally, I'm a venture capitalist. Before this, I worked in strategy consulting, serving some work in government, some work in foundations and many corporates. I spent some time actually working for the government of Canada doing financial regulation. A lot of the industries I think a lot about, like financial services or energy or healthcare, are highly regulated, and I want to understand how that was. And then I also spent some time doing investment banking, which is kind of more traditional finance, but also working across, I probably worked across 20 countries over my career, which I've been really lucky to do. And I think that kind of context has helped me as a VC, and I valued. In the book, I have a chapter around this idea of cross-pollinators, which I think is relevant, which in many ways, the best entrepreneurs around the world have a little bit of this cross-pollinating approach. Like, I think we have this conventional wisdom that, 22-year-old hoodied warrior taking down a new industry. But actually, if you look at the data around the world, the best entrepreneurs have worked across a bunch of different functions, industries, are older, and are truly experts in their field and solving a problem. And so that's, if I was going to generalize this to advice, I'd say, look, like, I actually thinking about how to be a cross-pollinator and leverage that to really solve a problem, but then actually pull many capital and talent from your network, I think is really powerful.
Yeah, and I think also you do get that misconception, based on the idea of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, that, the people behind massive startups and innovation, because they're the key figures, that it's all to do with, being in your early 20s and being a youth and everything. But realistically, for most people, the minute their company actually goes beyond a small size company, it's that expertise and experience that's going to see you go through a growth stage and actually be able to scale the company successfully.
By the way, so totally agree. By the way, one of the things that's not appreciated a lot is actually the same trend is also true for Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. If you actually look at the stock performance of their companies, they actually did better as those leaders became older and more experienced, right? So the the multiple and the stock price appreciation in both of those did better in their 40s than they did in their 20s, despite the fact that they just happened to be CEOs that scaled and stayed at the helm. They actually, age and experience still really matter, and it definitely played out in their stories too.
So I've received a bunch of different questions towards COVID-19, but I'll just kind of summarize it into like one general question, where it's pretty much the idea of on a venture capital perspective, how has investing changed? Are people holding off from doing deals? Are they rushing to do deals, but in totally different sectors? I mean, obviously, we've seen some companies have had a massive rise, like Zoom, for example. And also, what would we see change post COVID-19 as we're coming out of it when it comes to venture capital, and also what would probably be more popular sectors post COVID-19 compared to pre-COVID-19?
Okay, there's a lot to unbundle there. I'll talk in my personal capacity and share some thoughts. One is, what's happening today. And so I think we need to separate this exact moment, right? Some of us are in the eye of the storm in many parts around the world, right? We're on lockdown, right? Like there's this very defined period. Then there's kind of the next 3 months. And then there's kind of what happens after that, right? There's a couple of these different, like ultra short term, and kind of medium-ish term in question. If I was going to take kind of the medium to long-term view, I'd say, look, there's more venture capital today than there's ever been. Startups offer uncorrelated returns to the stock market, right? In the sense that if you're investing in an early stage startup, obviously the exit multiples matter with the stock market, but actually what really matters in the early days is execution, and great businesses get built in tough times. So like my long-term view on this is incredibly optimistic. In the short term, like we are in the eye of the storm, and some VCs have companies that they are dealing with and they're having problems and have to solve and have made commitments to those entrepreneurs. Some VCs are in the middle of fundraising. Some VCs are doing later stage stuff, and some VCs are doing earlier stage stuff, right? And so the dynamics are I believe, very different across the ecosystem. That being said, my general sentiment talking to a bunch of folks in the Valley, and actually I'd be really curious to hear your perspective and what you're seeing in the region as well, is that folks are still investing, folks are still looking at stuff. It's one of these, I saw a tweet around, look, like we're still investing, but customer service might be a little bit slower because we're dealing with all these other things. I think there's a little bit of this going on too. And I think people are also readjusting, right? I think we're readjusting to the world of how do you do diligence in the context of Zoom, right? We're trying to figure out where some of the cards are landing, et cetera, too. So I think there's a bunch of that happening in the context. I personally feel totally comfortable going through the diligence and investing process virtually, but I like most of the entrepreneurs I've met that I've invested in, I've known for a while before I've invested, and that's because there's this amazing statistic I tell my students that the average venture relationship is longer than the average American marriage, and that's stunning. But actually, it's really important to build a relationship, and if you're going to do this in the virtual world, it's harder. And so I think you need to invest towards that. And I think that's something to think about. But I think, look, I think in the long term, or even the medium term, I'm incredibly bullish. And I think the hard thing is getting through this tough period. The second part of your question is, how are things changed? I'll give you my optimistic stance, which I think is an extension of some of the trends that I explore in the book, which is I actually am really excited about this moment as a leveler for access to capital for folks around the world. right? All of a sudden, my day, it doesn't matter if I'm talking to an entrepreneur in San Francisco or an entrepreneur in Bahrain or an entrepreneur anywhere around the world, the experience is exactly the same. It's the experience we're having now over Zoom, right? And if the first, second, third, or fourth meetings can all be done by Zoom and build that relationship and understand the business, you know, I still think that long term, right, when we come back to normal, in person is going to be really important, right? Like I think it's important for people to break bread together and spend some time and due diligence and like
human interaction.
For entrepreneurs to get to know the VC, because that partnership is really important. So I don't think that's going to go away, but I think that you can do so much of the upfront stuff now by Zoom. And so I'm very optimistic that more people will get capital from places that don't have capital today. And so I think that's going to happen. Or at least I hope it will, because I think it's the right thing to do. And I think it's the right opportunity to chase. And then your question of like, how will sectors evolve? And I definitely don't have a crystal ball. However, I think that we're undergoing a really interesting experiment where all of a sudden we are all forced to digitize right away, right? There was, I saw a joke.
That part's the blessing in disguise, I think, kind of.
Oh, I think it's one of the blessings. Yeah. And I saw a thing on the internet, which is this, you know, who forced the digitization of your company? CEO, CFO, COVID-19, right?
Yeah.
Like all of a sudden, every company that has been putting off R&D investing or a shift towards cloud or whatever has to do it, right? All of a sudden, every company needs to have a plan on how to do remote and how do you actually get security for your business, like all these questions. Like all of a sudden, everyone has to deal with these things. And all of a sudden, people are practicing to learn from home, right? Ed tech is getting tried. People are working from home. People are doing on-demand delivery of food. And so I'm not sure that all these behaviors will stick 100% after, but definitely we've had this moment where everyone's adopted. We've seen that with the Zoom adoption numbers. And I think we're seeing that across a bunch of different categories. And so I think this will be a pretty powerful accelerator on a bunch of different dynamics, and not just in consumer behavior, but on the regulatory front. Like all of a sudden, we now have to allow telemedicine in regions where that wasn't regulatory allowed, or in the US, reimbursement rates weren't the same for them. All of a sudden, we need to figure out how we do notarization digitally instead of having to do wet signature. All these things I think are going to get accelerated. And so it isn't just the customer behavior, it's a lot of these thornier things that take a while to change laws, et cetera, that I think are going to get accelerated perhaps in different industries. And so I think to your point, I think is right. Like I think perhaps that's the silver lining where I think this will be an opportunity for, and likely very much so for a lot of your listeners who are also, you know, building startups or pushing innovation.
Yeah, and just touching on that point where you brought up how edutech will see a great rise out of the whole COVID-19 scenario. Naturally, everybody needs to continue their education, and people that are working at home want to keep their kids busy as well and let them basically have something to do while they can go about their daily business and doing their work tasks. And we had a question come in where one of our listeners was saying the contrary, where they said a lot of people don't talk about the edutech applications, or even we don't hear much news about funded projects in edutech. So do you think there is a market for edutech? I'd say by the contrary, there's a gigantic market for edutech, and what we've seen now more than ever will be the rise of that. And perhaps it was not reported as much earlier because people still hadn't been forced out of their comfort zone and probably preferred their kids having that physical interaction. I think after the months and months of this distance learning going on, it will become a norm for the whole world, and we'll see a massive adoption of edutech platforms across the globe, pretty much.
Yeah.
What are your
insights? Two observations. I agree with that. Two observations. One is, I think as a society, we have undervalued teachers. And I think we now realize how important and how incredibly talented, you know what I mean? Like, I think one, we're going to have a new appreciation for teachers and the professionals that are doing this. I mean, the second is, you know, university students and others, like, I think that this is a moment where we're going to question the value of in-person education, right? If you are paying $40,000 a year for a university degree at a big American university or whatever, and all of a sudden you have to do it from home and you're getting the same degree and paying that amount of money, like, that doesn't feel great. And so all of a sudden, I think there's going to be this questioning of what is education, et cetera. And look, like, I think I'm optimistic on the sector, right? I think there's so many things we can do to evolve the way we learn that isn't having some person, and I'm one of those people, like, at the front of a class and teaching us, right? But around kind of adapting the curriculum to the learning and learning speed and style of students, to having much more interactive types of classes. I think there's so much potential there. I think it's important to remember that, like, the context we're living right now is not normal, right? Like, the context of work from home or learning from home is not, like, we're doing it when there's a macroeconomic uncertainty, we're scared of our health, like, there's no childcare, like, all this stuff. So the stuff that's working right now is kind of a band-aid. It isn't necessarily what's going to work long term, but I think it's going to push us towards it, and it's helping us test what is really helpful.
Yeah, it's almost kind of a surreal scenario that it's we found ourselves in nowadays. So we've had another question that's come in. I find it kind of a bit surprising, but, like, I'd like to see your feedback on it. It's to go back to the full stack idea. Somebody was asking, don't you think that some of the governments should get involved with financing towards creating APIs that are, I guess, of a generic nature that entrepreneurs could use in their businesses? Example, addresses, IDs, etc.
Yeah, look, I think in many ecosystems, some of these things are big problems, and the government has not solved them. And in that void, entrepreneurs, if you want to build a logistics delivery company, if you want to build a bank account, you need addresses and you need identity, you need ways to satisfy the laws. And so as a result, entrepreneurs have done it. I think that we're going to see, as entrepreneurial ecosystems start scaling, some horizontal infrastructure get built, and that will help. That won't solve everything, but I think we're going to see that a little bit. And I think we are seeing some experiments where ecosystem builders are building parts of it in service to their countries. I think the Aadhaar system is exciting, and I had interviewed Nandan Nilekani, who was in charge of that program. He was the founder of Infosys, kind of one of the early pioneers in the Bangalore ecosystem, and I'm actually tremendously excited to see how that'll play out. I think that's kind of a good example of a public good that can be built that can not only support innovators, but kind of everyone in the ecosystem, and also citizens and consumers. And so I think there are things to do. I probably don't have a blanket statement on that, but I think there are areas where there are public goods, and I think there's a role for ecosystem builders. I think there's other areas where startups will build some horizontal infrastructure over time, and that'll do some of those solutions too. So I think it's a really interesting question that I don't have a high level answer to, but I think we can have a more specific conversation to a particular context or question later on.
And we've had a lot of feedback as well regarding the concept of a Camel startup. So
Okay.
What we've had is first, for companies that they feel have not geared themselves towards being a Camel startup, how can they work as an investor to help their company kind of geared towards being more resilient and adaptable to the market? And as a VC, what key traits do you look for to detect a great Camel startup?
Yeah. So I think flipping is tough, right, on a dime. Someone once called venture capital jet fuel, and if that's jet fuel, it's tough to switch to diesel, if that makes sense. But I think that being a Camel is not just an approach. I think it's a philosophy. And that philosophy is one where you're doing a bunch of these things that I described. And in the book, I talk about this in a lot more detail, but kind of these notions of how do you actually think about pricing and charging for the value you create from the get-go, and building sustainable economics at the unit economic level. Two is, how do you think about it from a cost structure? One of the things that the Grubhub example is interesting, by the way, to come back to that one. If you think of the valley of death, theirs wasn't a big valley. It was actually what I call ditches of death. Right? They raised around, did a growth spurt, raised around, did a growth spurt, and then their revenue kind of was wavy. It still went up and to the right very quickly, but they balanced the growth with an ability to get to sustainability and resilience when they needed to, and manage a longer fundraising process if they had it, or go through the crisis or what have you. And so, I think to switch to it, I think is thinking very critically around those questions around what is the unit economic business model of this and does it work? Two is, how do you actually think about the cost structure of the business and does that work over the time? And that obviously, if you're a VC, couples with how much capital are you offering your company and helping them get through this tough time? Because I think this is really an opportunity to step up and support companies. And three is kind of this outlook. And so, the question is like how I think about it. I spent a lot of my time on unit economics and kind of the business model for a while. I also spent a lot of my time understanding the entrepreneur and, what is it that they want out of the business and what is the timeline upon which they're operating, right? Like my belief is, to build a world-changing company takes a long time. And this isn't a couple-year ride. This is a long ride. And I think that's something that I spend a lot of time learning and making sure that there's mutual fit, and I want them to get to know me as well. And so I spend a lot of time on that dynamic too.
Great. So I think that's the last question for us, and we'll start to wrap everything up now. So what was the best way for people, basically, if they want to get their hands on Out-Innovate? We've had some people ask if they can get their hands on the ebook. Some have asked to be able to get the physical copy. Where can they go to find your book, and where could they go to find out more about you? We even had someone ask if you wanted to be a partner in a fintech company. So perhaps there's a way they can contact you directly about that. But yeah.
No, I really appreciate it. So my book, Out-Innovate, How Global Entrepreneurs from Delhi to Detroit Are Rewriting the Rules of Silicon Valley is out anywhere books are sold. You could buy it on Amazon or a bunch of other places, including bookstores. So that's one spot. If you want to sign up to my newsletter, you can do it at alexlazarow.com. So ALEXLAZAROW.com, or you can follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn as well. Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun. And
you're welcome. It was a pleasure having you. And also to our listeners, we're going to be doing a recap of this. And while we do that, we're going to put in all the information on how you can find out more about Alex Lazarow and his book and the different places you can purchase it from. And thank you for joining us. If you're viewing this on YouTube and have enjoyed this interview, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, if there are any other topics you'd like to see us cover, please let us know in the comments section. We appreciate your feedback. And thank you all for joining us. And thank you for joining us, Alex. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye.